Welcome back to The Curious Case. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Don't forget to subscribe. We bring you a brand new mystery every evening. Now, get comfortable, pour a warm cup of tea, and let's begin tonight's story. It was autumn eve, the night before All Hallows. Lanterns glowed along the lanes, their lights soft and trembling. The air smelled of apples, wood smoke, and rain waiting in the clouds. Children laughed, their voices carried by the wind. The doors closed gently, curtains drew tight, and somewhere beyond the hedges footsteps did not return. No one noticed the silence at first. No one saw the empty path that should have led home. But before dawn, the whisper began. Someone was missing, someone who had been seen only hours ago beneath the old church bell. And now, as the candles flicker low, the village pretends everything is as it was. But behind every polite smile, Miss Marple sees what others miss. Where are you listening from tonight? The vicarage at Ravenwell always felt alive on festival nights. By dusk, the old hall was already glowing with lamplight, the windows fogged from laughter and steam. Mrs. Clara Hensley, the vicar's wife, moved briskly between the tables, her arms full of teacups and raffle tickets. She had a voice that could command a room, and a smile that forgave every small mistake. Miss Marple, wrapped in her soft grey shawl, sat near the front, folding tickets with neat precision. "Your corners are perfect, as always," Clara said with fond exasperation. "One must respect even small duties," Miss Marple replied, her eyes twinkling. Her hands never hesitated, her mind never wandered. Beside her, the young curate, Peter Alden, was tying orange ribbons to the pews, humming absently out of tune. He was earnest, well-meaning, and far too trusting, a combination Miss Marple always found concerning. From the kitchen came the scent of ginger cake and cinnamon. Mrs. Beale, the cook, barked orders at a girl carrying cider jugs. "That one's for the raffle, not your thirst," she scolded, though her laughter followed. At the far end of the hall, Lydia Grant, a visiting piano teacher from London, was tuning the parish piano. Each note rang bright, cheerful, too modern for the room's old timbers. "Just a little touch of city sparkle," she said airily when the vicar raised an eyebrow. He chuckled, adjusting his spectacles. "Let us pray the village survives it." The hall filled quickly. Boots scraped against the wooden floor, cloaks were hung, and chatter rose like birds startled from hedgerows. Old Mr. Kemp took his usual corner seat, grumbling about the cost of apples. The schoolmistress, Miss Drew, tried to guess the number of sweets in the jar. Everything looked ordinary, peaceful, unshakably so, and yet something faint stirred beneath it. Miss Marple noticed it the way one feels a change in air pressure. A glance quickly withdrawn. Lydia Grant, pausing too long at the door. A quiet conversation near the back where laughter died too soon. The pianist's hand trembled before striking the next note. Marple said nothing. She only smoothed the next strip of tickets and smiled politely at the vicar's wife. The church bell tolled 7. Outside, the wind brushed through the apple trees. Inside, the village laughed, unaware that this night, this ordinary night, was already slipping into memory. And somewhere among the light and laughter, the first shadow had already chosen its place to stand. The vicarage at Ravenwell looked peaceful that evening. A soft fire burned in the grate, and the scent of ginger cake drifted through the hall. Outside, the last of the daylight faded behind the orchard trees, leaving the windows to glow like lanterns. Mrs. Clara Hensley, brisk and bright, arranged teacups on a polished tray. She had managed every harvest eve since her husband's appointment, and nothing ever escaped her notice. "Fold the tickets in half, dear," she told Miss Marple kindly. "It keeps the corners tidy." Miss Marple nodded, already halfway through the stack. "Order," she said softly, "is the closest thing we have to peace." At the long table, Peter Alden, the young curate, tied orange ribbons around the cider jugs. He worked earnestly, his brow furrowed as if the fate of the parish depended on each knot. Miss Marple smiled at him, patient and amused. Youth, she thought, always takes small things too seriously. Lydia Grant, the visiting piano teacher, arrived next, wrapped in a red shawl that didn't quite suit her gentle face. Her perfume arrived a moment before she did something faintly floral, faintly foreign. "Forgive my delay," she said lightly. "The train was dreadful, and the porter worse." She laughed at her own remark, though no one else did. The vicar, Mr. Hensley, smiled in good humour. "Ravenwell will seem quiet after London," he said. "Oh, I hope not too quiet," Lydia replied, her eyes lingering just for a heartbeat on the curate. From the kitchen came the clatter of plates and misses. Beale's voice calling for sugar. The room felt full, alive with harmless talk. Miss Marple listened as she worked, her delicate fingers folding each ticket with care. The rhythm soothed her fold. Crease, stack, fold. It was how she thought best. Across the hall, Elsie Partridge, the grocer's niece, was hanging paper bats from the rafters. She was shy, eager to please, and looked often toward Lydia with quiet admiration. Once, Miss Marple caught her watching the pianist, with a look that was almost longing. But when noticed, the girl flushed and turned away quickly, her hands trembling as she reached for another string. A small thing, a human thing. Miss Marple tucked it into memory. By 7, the first villagers had arrived. Boots scuffed, chairs scraped, and laughter began to fill the room. The raffle box jingled. Children darted about with paper masks and sticky fingers. The vicar's wife beamed with satisfaction. "All is well," she declared, though her tone carried a trace of relief rather than certainty. Miss Marple looked up from her work. The piano struck its opening note bright, but slightly off-key. She said nothing, but her brow furrowed faintly. Harmony, she knew, was fragile. It took only one discordant sound to remind a village that peace was never permanent. And somewhere between laughter and music, a pair of eyes met briefly across the room, then quickly looked away. The Harvest Eve gathering was in full swing. The vicarage hall shimmered with candlelight, the scent of cider and spice thick in the air. Laughter echoed against the old beams, soft and comforting, like a hymn half-remembered. Miss Marple sat near the window, her knitting untouched in her lap, observing the small theatre of village life unfold before her. The raffle began with cheerful confusion. Mr. Kemp insisted his number had been called twice, though it had not. Mrs. Drew laughed until her spectacles fogged. The curate, flustered, offered him a jar of plum jam as peace offering. A harmless scene, perfectly ordinary, yet in the midst of it something trembled, not in sound but in silence. A note out of tune, faint but persistent, the kind only certain ears notice. Miss Marple glanced at the piano. Lydia Grant's fingers danced gracefully, but her smile faltered between measures. Her eyes drifted not toward the sheet music, but toward the far door, where the garden waited in darkness. Beside the refreshment table, Elsie Partridge fumbled a tray of teacups. They crashed softly, not loud enough to startle, but enough to turn heads. "Sorry, miss," she stammered. Lydia hurried to help her, kneeling to gather the shards. "Clumsy thing," Lydia murmured, though her voice lacked sharpness. Their hands brushed for a moment, brief, charged. "I've forgotten." Miss Marple watched the exchange, a single brow lifting, her expression unreadable. The vicar, kind and oblivious, raised his glass for a short blessing. He spoke of gratitude, fellowship, and the blessings of simple lives. The room joined in polite applause, but Miss Marple noticed the timing, Lydia's delayed clap, Elsie's nervous smile, Peter Alden's restless glance toward the door. Threads, she thought. Loose threads waiting to be pulled. Outside, wind moved through the apple trees. Leaves brushed against the windows, whispering like old secrets. A lantern guttered, then flared again. For a moment, the light shifted across Lydia's face, catching something hard beneath her charm, fatigue perhaps, or fear. Miss Marple folded her hands, the gesture slow, deliberate. She had lived long enough to sense when harmony turned hollow. It was not loud, not violent, but it was there, the quiet pulse of unease. A heartbeat beneath laughter, a glance that lingered 1 second too long. The raffle continued. Voices rose again. The moment passed, or seemed to, but Miss Marple did not look away. Her gaze lingered on the door where the cool air crept in, carrying the faintest scent of damp soil and something sharper metallic, fleeting, gone before thought could name it. Something uneasy, she murmured under her breath, always hums beneath happiness. The piano played on. The laughter resumed. And outside, in the darkness just beyond the hedge, the night began to listen. The music broke first. A single, sharp note that never found its end. Then silence. Miss Marple looked up from her chair. The laughter that had filled the vicarage hall only moments ago dissolved, as though swallowed by the walls. From beyond the doorway came hurried footsteps on gravel. A voice, faint at first, then rising with fear. "Someone come quickly. There's someone by the hedge." The piano stool scraped backward. Chairs toppled. Candle flames shivered in the sudden rush of air. Peter Alden, the curate, was the first to move. He seized a lantern from the hook and dashed outside, the vicar close behind. For a few long seconds the hall held its breath. Mrs. Hensley clutched the tablecloth with trembling hands. "Probably a fainting spell," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple did not answer. Her eyes, calm and sharp, stayed on the open doorway. She listened to wind, to breath, to the rhythm that had left the room. Outside, the lanterns bobbed between the apple trees. Shadows twisted across the grass. A murmur rose, then broke into shouts. One word carried back into the hall like a chill draught. "Help! Mrs." Beale crossed herself. Someone began to cry. The smell of cider and cinnamon turned suddenly cloying. Miss Marple rose, setting her knitting aside, and moved quietly toward the door. The vicar appeared first, pale as parchment. His lantern swung from his hand, throwing wild circles of light across the walls. He opened his mouth twice before sound came. It's Miss Grant." A gasp moved through the crowd like a single breath. Lydia, the piano teacher, the one who had smiled so brightly an hour ago. They followed the vicar into the garden. The grass was wet beneath their shoes, glistening with dew or something darker. Lanterns flickered against the hedgerow, revealing a shape half hidden in shadow. Her red shawl, once vivid, was torn where it caught on the thorn branches. One arm lay across the path, the other curled beneath her. Her hair spilled loose across the ground. Her face was still. Miss Marple knelt carefully, her movements gentle, precise. She did not touch the body. She only looked at the angle of the head, the faint mark along the wrist, the glint of something pale near the fingers. A torn edge of paper. She noted it, said nothing. The curate whispered, She was there when I came. Around the hedge. I thought she'd fallen." But the vicar, voice trembling, spoke the words everyone feared. "No fall does this." Wind moved through the trees, soft, unfeeling. A lantern guttered out. Someone sobbed into the dark. Miss Marple straightened slowly, her eyes fixed on the still figure. Her tone, when she finally spoke, was quiet, almost reverent. She was dead. No one spoke at first. The air itself seemed to have stopped moving. Only the sound of the lantern chains swaying in the breeze broke the silence. The villagers stood in a loose circle, their faces pale, their hands half lifted as if unsure what to do next. Mrs. Hensley whispered something that never quite reached words. The curate muttered a prayer that faltered midway. Even the vicar's voice failed him. He stared at the lifeless shape by the hedge, unable to speak the comfort his calling demanded. Miss Marple stood a little apart, her hands folded neatly before her, her expression unreadable. She had seen this kind of silence before, the kind that falls not from grief, but from disbelief. It was too sudden for sorrow, too close for thought. Someone moved forward to cover the body. A wool shawl was laid gently across Lydia Grant's shoulders, hiding the stillness that none could bear to see. The lantern light caught the tear in the fabric, the dirt pressed into its edge. Small things, but Miss Marple's eyes lingered on them. Mrs. Beale's voice cracked through the hush. She was fine an hour ago, laughing, playing. "Oh, Lord, what could have—" The vicar raised a hand, but the sound of his sigh seemed louder than any command. "Inside, all of you," he said quietly. His tone was firm, but it trembled at the edges. The group hesitated, reluctant to turn their backs on what they feared. Miss Marple knelt for a moment, just long enough to look. The ground told stories that people tried to forget. 2 sets of footprints led into the hedge, one light, one heavier, overlapping, and near the girl's hand lay the small torn scrap she had noticed before. White paper, crumpled and damp from the grass. Just one corner, its edge uneven, as though ripped hastily from a letter. A gust of wind lifted a strand of Lydia's hair and carried the faint scent of perfume floral, faintly bitter. Miss Marple closed her eyes for half a second, then straightened. The ribbon caught her eye next, a thin strip of orange silk tangled in the thorns. She looked at it, without touching it. The same color as the decorations that hung in the hall. The same hue Elsie had tied to the cider jugs earlier. A harmless detail. And yet details were never harmless. Behind her, the crowd began to murmur again. Half-spoken theories, nervous comfort, the soft shuffle of shoes retreating towards safety. Miss Marple stayed where she was. She waited until the last lantern moved away, until only the vicar remained, his head bowed. He whispered, "God forgive whoever did this." Miss Marple looked down at the paper scrap one last time. "God may," she said softly, "but memory rarely does." The lantern light dimmed, the night pressed close again, and the silence returned, heavier now, as though it understood what they did not, that something terrible had begun, and it would not let go easily. By morning, the whole village of Ravenwell had heard. The vicarage garden was still roped off with thin cord, though the wind tugged at it uselessly. Rain had passed in the night, leaving the cobblestones slick and shining like glass. The church bell tolled once, low and slow, and the sound lingered too long. At the Bluebell tea shop, the bell above the door rang endlessly. Every chair was taken. Every whisper was the same story told with new embellishment. Tragic, simply tragic, Mrs. Clara Bantry declared, though her tone carried more curiosity than grief. She was such a pretty girl. Not one of us, of course, but pretty. Mrs. Dodds leaned closer, lowering her voice. "They say she had London friends. You know what that means." Mrs. Bantry gasped as though scandal had walked through the door itself. "London always means something, my dear." Miss Marple sat quietly at her usual corner table, tea cooling beside her. She didn't interrupt. She never did. Her knitting needles clicked softly, steady as a heartbeat. She looked for patterns not in wool but in people. And this morning, the pattern was spreading quickly. The door opened again. In came Constable Evans, earnest and too young for the seriousness in his step. He greeted the ladies politely and ordered nothing, which told Miss Marple he was uncomfortable. "The inquest's been scheduled," he said, clearing his throat. "Doctor's report should be ready by tomorrow." Mrs. Dodds clutched her pearls. "Was it murder, then?" Evans hesitated. "We don't use that word yet, ma'am." Which, to anyone listening, was confirmation enough. Miss Marple lifted her cup without drinking. She watched the constable's hands trembling, ink-stained, gripping his hat too tightly. He had seen something he couldn't name yet. She filed that away in the quiet part of her mind where truth waited for company. Mrs. Bantry whispered again. "I heard she argued with someone before the raffle. Mr. Kemp said she left the piano early." Mrs. Dodds nodded eagerly. "They said she went outside, alone. Imagine, at night, in that wind. Or not alone," Mrs. Bantry added meaningfully. They both fell silent just long enough for the suggestion to take root. Miss Marple smiled faintly, setting her cup down with precision. "People often remember what others were doing," she said softly, "but rarely where they themselves were." The ladies blinked, unsure if it was advice or rebuke. By the time they decided, Miss Marple had already resumed her knitting. Outside, the rain began again, tapping against the tea-shop window. Across the street, the constable stood by the vicarage gate, talking to someone out of view. Miss Marple saw a flash of orange fabric, perhaps, or ribbon. It caught the wind and vanished behind the hedge. She didn't rise to follow it. Not yet. Instead, she sipped her tea, her gaze calm, her thoughts deliberate. Truth, she knew, never arrived loudly. It drifted in like rain, soft, persistent, and impossible to ignore once it began. Inspector Harold Cray arrived just after noon. His motor car, a grey Morris, streaked with rain and mud, came to an abrupt stop outside the vicarage gate. He stepped out slowly, adjusting his hat, his coat heavy with drizzle. He was not a man of charm, but of precision. And precision, Miss Marple thought, was sometimes mistaken for coldness. She watched him from across the lane, her shopping basket in hand. His stride was firm, deliberate, the kind of gait that carried authority before words did. The constable hurried beside him, notebook ready, but the inspector waved him off. "I'll speak with the vicar first," he said curtly. Then his eyes caught hers sharp, assessing but not unkind. He tipped his hat. "Miss Marple, isn't it? You have a reputation." She smiled mildly. "An undeserved one, I'm sure." Cray gave a small grunt, the closest he came to humor. He glanced at the tea shop behind her. "Half the village seems to be in there, and all of them talking." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Gossip, properly sorted, is data. You might find the tea helpful, too." He paused, studying her face as though weighing that sentence. Then, almost reluctantly, he nodded. "I'll keep it in mind." They walked together toward the garden gate. The cordon still fluttered in the wind, now more symbolic than secure. Cray crouched near the hedge where Lydia Grant had fallen. He spoke as if to the ground itself. No struggle, no sign of theft. If she was meeting someone, it was by choice. Miss Marple nodded. "Choice can be as dangerous as chance." He looked up sharply. "You think she knew her killer?" "I think she trusted them," she said simply. "And trust, Inspector, often writes its own epitaph." He straightened, brushing mud from his coat. "Her pupils say she was cheerful. The vicar's wife says she seemed distracted. The London friends claim she had no enemies." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Everyone is harmless until they aren't." Cray looked toward the house. "I'll need statements from those who saw her last. The raffle crowd, the kitchen staff, the girl who dropped the cups." "Elsie Partridge," Miss Marple supplied. Her tone was quiet, factual. "She was fond of Miss Grant. Too fond, perhaps." Cray's pen paused mid-note. "Too fond?" Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the hedge. "Affection is a complicated thing, Inspector. It grows where it shouldn't, stays when it's unwelcome, and sometimes turns cruel when it's ignored." He said nothing for a long moment. The wind moved again, rustling through the apple trees, scattering pale leaves across the path. At last he exhaled. "I've worked 30 years, Miss Marple. Facts, motive, means that's my trade." "But you—" She smiled. "I sort people, Inspector. They're far messier than data, but infinitely more revealing." He tipped his hat again, a gesture of reluctant respect. "Then perhaps we'll both keep sorting." She inclined her head. "Indeed. Just mind what the village tells you. In Ravenwell, truth always wears another's voice." And with that, she turned back toward the lane, leaving Cray to his evidence and the echo of her words. Inspector Cray returned to the garden after the villagers had gone. The clouds hung low and grey, pressing against the rooftops. The air smelled of damp soil and cold iron. Miss Marple joined him, her steps keyed, her shawl drawn close. Cray knelt near the hedge. The earth was churned slightly where two people had stood. He pointed with his pencil. One set of prints here, small, the other heavier. They overlap. Miss Marple crouched beside him. "The lighter pair belongs to Miss Grant, I think. The heavier, perhaps a man's, though not certain." She traced the edges of one footprint with her gloved finger. "It's the hesitation that matters, Inspector. See here. One step firm, one uncertain. That's not pursuit, it's decision." Cray frowned. "Decision?" "Yes. Someone debating whether to leave or stay." Her tone softened. "Small things speak loudly when truth hides." They moved closer to the hedge. The ribbon still fluttered there, orange, frayed, and dusted with dew. Cray plucked it free carefully. "This color matches the decorations inside." Miss Marple nodded. "Or perhaps the decorations match it. The difference can matter." She studied the ends, one torn clean, the other rough and stretched. Pulled in haste, not cut. Cray placed it into an envelope. He wrote, "Ribbon orange silk," and underlined it twice. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on it. Ribbons are meant to adorn, not conceal, yet here it covers something ugly. Cray glanced at her. You always speak as if things feel. They do, she said quietly. They remember how they were used. They walked the edge of the garden path. The lantern hooks swayed gently, their glass still smudged from last night's wind. Near the stone post, Cray bent to retrieve something half buried in the dirt, a small black button. The stitching thread still clung to one side. "Men's coat," he said. Miss Marple took it lightly, turning it in the grey light. "Not new. See the polish worn from handling. Someone nervous, perhaps, someone who touches their coat when thinking." She paused, looking toward the churchyard beyond the hedge. Nervous hands leave more behind than words ever do. Cray nodded toward the path. Doctor mentioned bruising on the wrist, a single mark right side. Miss Marple's voice stayed calm. Then she was held not violently but firmly, the way one might stop a conversation from ending. Cray's brow furrowed. "Perhaps a lover's quarrel, or a friend's plea," Miss Marple replied. "Affection and control share more than people admit." A crow called from the steeple above, sharp against the silence. They both looked up for a moment before Cray said, "You find meaning in trifles, Miss Marple." She smiled faintly. "Trifles are where people hide. Grand gestures tell you nothing. It's the crumbs that lead home." The inspector closed his notebook. Rain began to fall again, soft, persistent. They stood under the eaves as the ribbon fluttered once more, clinging to the wind like a memory unwilling to fade. Miss Marple watched it go and murmured, "Nothing vanishes, Inspector. It only waits to be seen." By afternoon, Ravenwell no longer sounded like a village. It breathed in whispers. Doors stayed half open, curtains half drawn. People greeted one another too quickly, voices too bright, as if good manners could chase away fear. At the post office, Mrs. Jenkins dropped her coins twice. Her hands shook so badly that the change scattered across the counter. "They say it was robbery," she whispered to the man behind her. Her purse was gone. He shook his head. "No. It was jealousy, mark my words. That piano girl had a look about her. Trouble in lipstick." Their words drifted out the open door, gathering others as they went. Rumors moved faster than truth ever could. Miss Marple walked through the square, her basket on her arm, eyes mild but steady. She stopped near the grocer's, pretending to study apples while listening. Two voices behind the counter, carried low but urgent. Thomas Finch was seen leaving the vicarage late, one said. He had mud on his boots. And Elsie Partridge was crying outside the hall, another added. "Crying's not guilt," the first replied. "No, but it's something." Miss Marple placed 3 apples in her bag and smiled politely at the grocer. "Rain again by evening, I think." He nodded, though his eyes stayed uneasy. Everyone in Ravenwell seemed to be watching everyone else. Even silence had begun to sound suspicious. Outside, Constable Evans stood by the notice board, guarding it as if it held state secrets. A paper pinned there announced, "Information requested regarding events of October 31st. No one read it aloud, but everyone had memorized it. When Miss Marple passed, Evans offered a stiff nod. "Inspector says we'll be questioning again tomorrow. People remember new things overnight." "They usually remember stories first," she said gently. He frowned, uncertain if that was agreement or warning. At the tea shop, Mrs. Bantry was already collecting names. 2 suspects, clear as day, she declared. Thomas Finch, for one, always too eager to help. Men like that hide tempers. Mrs. Dodds leaned in, thrilled. "And the girl Elsie. They say she followed Miss Grant everywhere. A strange affection, if you ask me." Miss Marple set her teacup down with quiet precision. "Strange affections," she said softly, "are still affections. But they can curdle when left unattended." Neither woman knew what to make of that, so they filled the silence with fresh certainty. Later, walking home, Miss Marple paused by the church gate. From there, she could see both suspects' homes, Thomas's cottage by the mill road and Elsie's small room above the grocer's. One light burned in each window. 2 lives, she thought, already shrinking beneath the weight of talk. She reached into her pocket, touching the folded scrap of paper she had kept. Torn, damp, handwritten. It whispered its single message in her mind again. Meet me there. Patterns were forming uneven, fragile, but visible now. Miss Marple looked up at the sky, grey and close. Truth, she murmured, moves like weather. It changes everyone before it arrives. And as the bell struck 5, the village held its breath, waiting for the next rumour to begin. That evening the fog returned to Ravenwell, low, soft and deliberate. It moved through the streets like a living thing, dimming lamps and swallowing distance. The villagers stayed indoors, though one light still burned at the edge of the churchyard. It came from the cottage of Mrs. Ada Ransom, the oldest soul in the parish. Miss Marple knew her well. A widow, nearly blind, but sharp where it mattered. She claimed she could smell lies the way some smell rain, and that, Miss Marple had often thought, was not far from the truth. When she knocked, the door opened before she could call out. "I thought it might be you," Mrs. Ransom said, her thin frame outlined by firelight. "They've been whispering through the hedges again. Poor girl." Miss Marple removed her gloves with quiet care. "May I come in?" "You may." I was expecting questions. The room smelled of lavender and smoke. A kettle hissed softly on the stove. Mrs. Ransom poured tea, her hands steady despite the tremor in her voice. "You saw something that night," Miss Marple said gently. "Or heard it?" The widow nodded, folding her hands around the cup. "I couldn't see much, the fog was thick, and my eyes aren't what they were. But sound carries, Miss Marple. Oh yes, sound carries." She leaned forward, eyes glinting under the lamplight. "I heard the gravel crunch outside the garden fence. 2 sets of steps, one slow, one quick. The heavier one spoke first. A man's voice, sharp, angry." "What did he say?" "Mrs." Ransom frowned in concentration. "Something like, 'You think you can just walk away.' That's how it sounded." The girl's voice came next, quiet, frightened, I think. She said, "Please, just let me explain." Then, nothing for a moment. Then, a sigh. Not like someone tired. Like someone giving up. Miss Marple sat very still. The kettle whistled, but neither of them moved to stop it. After a pause, the widow continued. "And then a sound I can't forget. A small one, but strange. A ring metal on stone. Like something falling and rolling away." Miss Marple's eyes lifted slightly. "A button, perhaps." "Could be. The kind that belongs to a man's coat." Silence filled the room again, except for the faint crackle of the fire. Mrs. Ransom sipped her tea, unbothered by the heaviness of what she'd said. "It was over fast," she murmured. "No shout, no struggle, only quiet. Too quiet." Miss Marple reached out and laid a gloved hand over hers. "Thank you," she said softly. "Sometimes memory is the only lamp left lit." When she stepped back into the fog, the air smelled of wet earth and faint perfume, floral, bitter, lingering. And somewhere near the hedge behind the cottage, something small glinted faintly in the grass. Miss Marple bent to look closer. A thread of orange silk caught on a thorn. The kind that had no reason to be there. She straightened, her breath misting in the cold air. A voice echoed in her mind. "You think you can just walk away." It wasn't just grief then. It was unfinished business. Inspector Cray called his interviews early the next morning. The rain had passed, but the sky still carried its color grey, bruised, uncertain. The vicarage sitting room became an improvised office, with chairs in uneven rows and the smell of damp wool filling the air. One by one, the villagers came. One by one, they spoke their truths or the versions of truth they preferred to live with. Miss Marple sat quietly by the hearth, her knitting in her lap, the needles still. Cray had invited her to observe, not intervene, but she knew observation often did the greater work. The first was Thomas Finch, the mill hand. He stood awkwardly, hat crushed between his hands. "She was alive when I left the hall," he said. "I went out back to fetch the cider barrel. Took longer than expected, that's all." Cray's eyes narrowed. "How much longer?" 15, 20 minutes, maybe more." Miss Marple looked up, calm. "Long enough to get mud on your boots," she said. Thomas's mouth twitched. "It had been raining, ma'am. Everyone had mud. Cray wrote something in his book, then dismissed him. The boy's relief was too quick, too loud. Next came Elsie Partridge. Her hands trembled as she smoothed her apron, but her eyes were clear, dry. "She was kind to me," she began. "Miss Grant," she always smiled, "said I played the piano better than I believed." Cray cut in. "You followed her outside?" Elsie blinked. "No, sir. I stayed in the kitchen helping Mrs. Beale. Ask her." Cray nodded. "I will." Miss Marple watched the girl's fingers. They kept tracing the hem of her sleeve, over and over, as though feeling for something that wasn't there. When the inspector ended the questioning, Elsie lingered. "Will you find who did it?" she asked softly. Cray said, "We'll find the facts." Miss Marple added gently, "Facts seldom hide for long. Only people do." The girl hesitated, then slipped out. The vicar and his wife gave their accounts next. Both spoke with polished grief. Mrs. Hensley mentioned hearing laughter near the garden earlier that night, but could not say whose. The vicar swore he had been tending to the raffle book. Each sounded rehearsed in their sorrow. When the room emptied, Cray stood by the window, jaw set. 3 stories, he muttered. All clean, all incomplete. Miss Marple folded her knitting. Clean stories are like spotless. Windows, Inspector. They show what's behind them only when the light shifts. He glanced over his shoulder. "You think they're lying?" She smiled faintly. "Not lying. Editing." Cray turned back to his notes. No struggle, no theft. Yet everyone's hands are trembling, even the ones who claim peace. Miss Marple rose, crossing to the table. She looked down at the button, the ribbon, the folded page of notes. "The past," she said softly, "always leaves fingerprints, just not where men look." Cray frowned. "Meaning?" She met his gaze. "Meaning your culprit isn't hiding in the shadows, Inspector. They're standing in the light exactly where decency expects them to be." She gathered her shawl and stepped toward the door. Outside, the bell tolled once more, hollow and heavy. Behind her, Cray exhaled, his pencil still poised above a page that no longer looked certain. The afternoon wore on heavy and airless. Rain clouds gathered again, pressing low over Ravenwell, though no drops had yet fallen. Inside the vicarage, the parlour felt close with warmth and unease. The questioning had ended hours ago, but the air had not cleared. Truth seldom left clean air behind. Miss Marple remained seated near the hearth, her teacup untouched, her eyes calm but searching. Across the room stood Elsie Partridge, twisting a handkerchief in her fingers until it nearly tore. She had come back of her own accord, claiming she had remembered something small. Inspector Cray stood near the window, notebook ready, his tone controlled. "What was it you remembered, Miss Partridge?" Elsie hesitated. Her gaze darted toward the floor. "It might not matter, sir. Only I saw someone pass the kitchen window before Miss Grant went outside." Cray leaned forward. "Who?" Elsie swallowed hard. "I'm not sure. A coat, maybe dark brown. Could have been Mr. Finch, but I couldn't swear to it." Her voice quavered on. The last word, but it wasn't fear of the inspector. It was the fear of hearing her own thoughts aloud. Miss Marple set down her cup quietly. "And you didn't mention this earlier?" Elsie shook her head. "I thought it wasn't important. Everyone says I imagine things." Her eyes glistened for the first time. "Miss Grant never thought that. She always listened." Miss Marple's tone softened. "And that kindness frightened you, didn't it? Because it made you hope." The girl's breath caught. Inspector Cray's pen paused in midair. Elsie's shoulders slumped as though something inside her had shifted, unbalancing everything she'd rehearsed. "I only wanted to be near her," she whispered. "She said she'd help me get to London one day, play in real concerts." Her voice cracked. Then she stopped talking about it, stopped, looking at me that way. A silence spread through the room, not awkward, but raw. Miss Marple waited. People filled silence faster than any question could. Elsie's hands trembled again. She met someone that week, a man. I think he made her different. She was happy and afraid at the same time. The night she died. I tried to talk to her, but she said she had an appointment. I asked who with, and she just smiled. I hated that smile. She pressed the handkerchief to her mouth. For a moment, no one moved. Cray said gently, "You followed her?" Elsie shook her head violently. "No, I wanted to, but I didn't." Her eyes met Miss Marple's for the first time, wide and hollow. I heard her laugh outside. Then I heard nothing. Nothing at all. Miss Marple stood, crossing the room with slow, deliberate steps. She took the torn handkerchief from Elsie's shaking hands, folded it once, and placed it on the table. "Guilt rarely shouts," she said quietly. "It trembles. And sometimes, my dear, it doesn't belong to the one trembling." Elsie's lips parted, as if to ask something, but no sound came. Cray closed his notebook softly. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. The first drops of rain began to fall against the window pane's light, hesitant, almost like fingers tapping for confession. The rain fell through the night, steady and unbroken, a kind of cleansing that never reached the heart. At the edge of the village, Miss Marple's cottage glowed softly beneath the lamplight. Inside, the fire had burned low, its embers pulsing faintly like thought itself. Her knitting lay beside her chair, untouched since dusk. Instead, her small writing desk was covered with papers, scraps, and a magnifying glass, her quiet battlefield. On one side lay the torn fragment found near Lydia Grant's hand. The ink had bled slightly from the damp, but a few letters remained visible. "Me. At." On another page rested a note given to the raffle committee weeks earlier, written in the same looping script. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles, bringing both closer under the lamplight. The curls of the letters, the slant, the pressure, they belonged to the same hand, and not Lydia's. She picked up the orange ribbon next, cleaned now but still faintly wrinkled where it had been pulled. A simple thing, yet its story was louder than words. That silk had not come from the decorations in the vicarage hall. She knew that with quiet certainty. Those ribbons were cut in precise lengths by Mrs. Hensley herself. This one was longer, and the shade was subtly deeper, closer to the ribbon that had trimmed Mrs. Hensley's hat, a hat she had worn the night of the party. A detail so small it might have been dismissed by anyone else. Miss Marple opened her notebook and began to list what remained unspoken. The ribbon, the torn paper, the missing button. Each belonged to someone who had stood near Lydia that evening. But only one of them had reason to feel both affection and resentment. She turned back to her desk drawer and drew out another folded page, one the inspector had overlooked. It was a thank-you note Lydia had sent to the vicar's wife after her arrival in Ravenwell. At the bottom, written in her graceful hand, was a line, "Your kindness has made me feel part of this village already." Miss Marple stared at the words a long moment. Kindness, she thought, was often the beginning of cruelty. Her gaze moved to the scrap again. The writing that had summoned Lydia to the hedge was not a man's. It was rounder, more deliberate, as if shaped by someone used to writing notes of sympathy, announcements, reminders. Someone who controlled the small details of other people's lives. She sat back, hands folded in her lap. Outside, the rain shifted from steady to soft, the kind that lulls the world into false comfort. Inside, a new stillness formed, one made not of peace, but of realization. The truth had taken its shape quietly, like a pattern emerging in wool when the light struck it just right. There had been no thief, no jealous lover, no desperate quarrel, only envy, carefully hidden beneath duty. A woman who had offered help too often, loved praise too much, and feared invisibility more than sin. Miss Marple closed her notebook, her lips tightening just slightly. She realized, she whispered to the empty room, who had written the invitation. The rain had ceased by morning, leaving the village washed pale and clean, as if pretending nothing had happened. Miss Marple walked the narrow lane toward the vicarage, her shawl drawn close against the chill. Each step was deliberate, unhurried. She had no need to summon courage. The truth, once seen, carried its own quiet gravity. Mrs. Clara Hensley opened the door before Miss Marple could knock. Her face was drawn, the usual brightness gone. "Miss Marple," she said faintly, You shouldn't be out in this cold. I find the air clears the mind, Marple replied. Her voice was calm, almost kind. May I come in? The vicar's wife hesitated only a moment before stepping aside. The parlour smelled faintly of polish and lavender. On the table lay a small sewing kit, threads in tidy rolls. The orange one, nearly identical to the ribbon found in the hedge, sat open. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on it only briefly before turning to the fire. You've been busy, she said gently. Mrs. Hensley's hands fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve. Just mending things. The vicar's cuffs needed attention. Miss Marple nodded. The small things always do. That's where truth hides, don't you think? The woman stiffened. I don't know what you mean. Oh, I think you do, Marple said softly. She moved closer to the table, her eyes resting on the folded scrap of paper near the sewing tin. I recognize your handwriting. You've written many such notes for the parish meeting reminders, invitations, sympathy cards, and one, on the afternoon of the fete, that read simply, Meet me at the hedge. The silence stretched. Outside, the church bell chimed once, then faded. Mrs. Hensley didn't answer. Her eyes glistened, but her voice remained steady. She wanted to leave, you know. She was going back to London. She said this place felt too small, too slow. After all I'd done for her introductions, lessons, kindness, she spoke as if I'd trapped her. Her breath trembled. I only wanted to matter. Miss Marple's gaze softened. And you did, she said gently, but not as you wished. You wanted gratitude to last forever. It never does. A tear slipped down the woman's cheek. I didn't mean. I only wanted to stop her, to make her listen. I pulled her arm. She stumbled. Then she was on the ground. I thought she'd wake. I swear I thought she'd wake. Miss Marple placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. Goodness rarely intends harm, Mrs. Hensley. But it can do it all the same. The woman's sob broke through, quiet but final, the kind that didn't ask for forgiveness, only recognition. When the inspector arrived moments later, Miss Marple was standing by the window, watching the mist lift from the garden. Mrs. Hensley sat motionless by the hearth, her confession half-spoken, half-swallowed. The air between them held no anger, only the weary stillness of truth settling into place. As Cray entered, Miss Marple turned slightly and said, almost to herself, she only wanted to matter. Inspector Cray arrived without sirens, without hurry. His motorcar rolled to a stop outside the vicarage gate, the engine ticking faintly in the cool air. A thin mist still clung to the hedges, softening every outline. The village watched from behind curtains, though no one dared open a door. Even curiosity this morning felt like a trespass. Miss Marple stood at the garden path, waiting for him. Her expression held neither satisfaction nor sorrow, only acceptance, like one greeting the inevitable. Inside, Mrs. Clara Hensley sat by the fire, still in the same chair where truth had found her. Her sewing lay untouched, the orange thread trailing like a quiet confession. Cray stepped into the room, hat in hand. He looked at the woman for a long moment before speaking. You know why I'm here? She nodded once, eyes dry, voice steady. Yes, Inspector. I suppose I do. Her tone carried no defiance, just exhaustion, the kind that follows after too much pretending. Miss Marple remained near the window, her gaze on the garden where the tragedy had begun. She said nothing. It was not her place to witness twice. Cray took a seat across from Mrs. Hensley. There's still time to explain, if you wish. She folded her hands neatly in her lap. There isn't much to explain, she murmured. She was going to leave. I asked her to stay until spring, just until spring. She laughed, not cruelly, but as if I didn't exist. I tried to stop her. She fell. That's all there is. Cray's pencil hesitated above his notebook. He wrote slowly, each word deliberate. The only sound in the room was the faint crackle of the fire. Outside, the bell in the tower marked the hour, each chime slow and measured. When he finally stood, he said softly, Mrs. Hensley, you'll need to come with me. Her hands trembled once, then stilled. She rose without help, smoothing her dress with habitual grace. "Will you tell my husband?" Cray nodded. "I'll see to it." Miss Marple turned then, her voice a quiet thread between them. "You did not mean to kill her, Mrs. Hensley, but you held too tightly to being needed. It's a common sin, one that ruins gentle people." The woman's eyes filled for the first time. "She trusted me," she whispered, "and I wanted that trust to last." Cray's voice was low, respectful. "Sometimes the things we try to keep alive are what we end up breaking." She gave a small, trembling nod. There were no protests, no tears, no pleading, just silence, the final, honest kind. Cray motioned to the constable waiting in the hall. They left together, slow steps echoing down the corridor. When the door closed, the house seemed to exhale. Miss Marple stood by the fire, watching the orange thread burn where it had fallen into the grate. Her face was calm, almost serene. "There was no shouting," she murmured, "only truth finding its voice." Outside, the bell tolled once more. The morning mist lifted, and Ravenwell, as it always did, began to forget. Evening returned gently to Ravenwell, as though the day itself wished to forget. The mist had lifted, and the rooftops glowed faintly beneath the amber hue of the setting Sunday. The church bell tolled 6 times, each note soft, measured, fading into distance. Inside her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, the room wrapped in stillness. Her knitting lay across her lap once. More pale wool, half finished, the needles moving with steady rhythm. The fire crackled softly, burning down to a bed of orange coals. Outside, sparrows gathered beneath the hedge, rustling for crumbs. All of it, she thought, was proof that life insists on continuing, even after sorrow, even after truth. She paused to pour herself a small cup of tea. Steam curled upward, catching the lamplight like a ghost. On the table beside her lay a single folded page. Inspector Cray's note confirming that Mrs. Hensley had made a full confession, calm and complete. No trial yet, no verdict, just a signature, admitting what words could no longer hide. Miss Marple read it once, then set it aside. The truth, she knew, did not end with signatures. It lingered in gestures, in glances, in the quiet spaces people left behind. She took up her knitting again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Kindness," she said softly, "can turn cruel when it fears being forgotten." The clock ticked, the fire sighed, her needles clicked with the slow, sure rhythm of thought, every movement deliberate, every silence meaningful. From the window she could see the church spire cutting through the twilight. A light glimmered faintly in the vicarage window, perhaps the vicar himself, sitting alone now, hands clasped in prayer or disbelief. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Pity was easier than judgment, and perhaps kinder. After all, no one begins wicked. They only end that way when fear outweighs grace. She looked down at her wool. It had tangled slightly, a knot forming where threads crossed too tightly. Her fingers worked patiently to free it, strand by strand. "Every soul hides its sharpest edge," she murmured, "in soft fabric." She smiled faintly. "And sometimes one must unravel a little to find the truth." The kettle clicked as it cooled. The wind moved through the garden, brushing against the window panes with the gentleness of memory. Peace had returned, not triumphant, but humble, quiet, earned. The kind of peace that does not erase what happened, only teaches the heart to live beside it. Miss Marple folded her knitting neatly and rose to draw the curtains. The last bell of the evening rang out across the village. Children would be calling their mothers from doorways. Lamps would flicker on, steady and small. Life, persistent and unashamed, would go on. She stood for a moment, her hand resting on the window latch, listening to the soft hum of the village breathing again. Outside, peace returned quietly, as it always does, and in the warm, forgiving glow of her firelight, Miss Marple whispered the final truth of the night. Evil passes, but goodness, in its quiet way, always stays.